"Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day?" whispered the black orphan to the white stranger. The man's shoes clicked steadily against the pavement as he hurried past the high iron fence of the orphanage. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his leather briefcase swung with each hurried step. His eyes were fixed ahead, his brow furrowed with the weight of 1,000 thoughts about meetings, deadlines, and phone calls. To him, this was just another street on his way to another obligation. The sound of children's laughter barely registered above the noise inside his mind. On the other side of the fence, the playground was alive. Swings creaked back and forth, a ball bounced along the cracked asphalt, and voices rose in playful shouts. Among the children, one small boy lingered at the edge, his dark brown skin glowing under the afternoon sun. He wore a worn but clean shirt, the hem tugged loose, and his shoes scuffed from too many days of running on gravel. His eyes followed the man walking by, not with mischief, but with a longing that seemed far older than his years. The boy's small hands tightened around the fence rails. He watched as the man's figure passed, as the polished shoes contrasted with the dusty sneakers around him, as the world of suits and briefcases brushed by the world of scraped knees and hand-me-downs. Something in the boy's chest stirred a quiet, desperate hope. He stepped away from the playground, heart racing, and slipped through the open gate unnoticed. His steps were quick, almost hesitant, until he reached the sidewalk where the man's tall figure loomed. With a courage that felt too heavy for someone so young, the boy tugged at the man's sleeve. The fabric was smooth beneath his fingers, nothing like the textures he was used to. The man stopped abruptly, glancing down with surprise, his brow lifting as he found himself staring into wide, pleading eyes. The boy's voice was barely more than a whisper, shy and trembling. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy, just for one day?" The words pierced the quiet air like a bell. The man blinked, frozen, the briefcase suddenly heavy in his grip. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The boy's gaze did not waver. His eyes were round, filled with hope and something deeper loneliness, hunger for belonging, for a hand to hold that was more than a caretaker's duty. Around them, the playground noise softened. A few children had stopped their games, watching curiously from behind the fence. A caretaker standing near the swings froze, her lips parting as she realized what had just been asked. The street, moments ago an ordinary path for a busy man, had become a stage for something entirely different. The man felt his throat tighten. He was a stranger here, wrapped in the armor of business and responsibility, yet the boy's touch and words broke through all of it. In that moment, he saw not just a child, but the weight of every day that boy had faced without a father, every longing stitched into a simple request. The world around them blurred, leaving only the quiet question that hung between them, fragile yet unshakable. The man stood rooted to the spot, the weight of the boy's words pressing into him harder than any deadline he had ever faced. His polished shoes were steady on the pavement, but his mind stumbled, unable to process the simple, impossible request. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to two pairs of eyes, his, wide with disbelief, and the boy's, round and filled with desperate hope. He cleared his throat, his hand tightening on the handle of his briefcase. "I'm sorry, kid," he said quickly, his voice clipped in the way it always was when he tried to push away something he didn't understand. "I don't have time. I have somewhere important to be." The words tumbled out like armor, a reflex to shield himself from the piercing innocence that had caught him so completely off guard. But the boy didn't flinch. His small fingers still held lightly to the man's sleeve, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "Please, just for one day. I just need someone." The sentence was short, but it seemed to echo down the street. The caretaker by the swings froze, her watering can suspended midair. The jogger who had been passing earlier slowed to a stop. A woman with grocery bags paused at the corner, staring openly. The request, repeated with such raw honesty, had transformed the sidewalk into a stage where every bystander now stood as an unwilling witness. The man shifted uncomfortably under the weight of those stares. He tried to laugh it off, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice softer but still edged with retreat. "I'm not the right person. I'm busy, and I don't—" His words trailed off as he met the boy's gaze again. Those eyes were too much wide, pleading, brimming with a longing no child should carry. The trembling in the boy's voice revealed not only need but the fear of rejection, the kind he had likely faced too many times already. Something in the man's chest twisted. His instinct told him to keep walking, to keep his life on track, to avoid entanglements that might slow him down. Yet his legs would not move. The murmurs from the crowd grew quieter as people sensed his hesitation, their curiosity now mingled with silent expectation. He opened his mouth again, but no excuses came. The boy's words lingered in the air, so simple yet so heavy. Pretend, just for one day. A request not for money, not for gifts, but for the illusion of belonging, for the chance to feel what others took for granted. The man realized, with a pang he did not want to name, that no meeting, no schedule, no carefully pressed suit had ever prepared him for this. And so he stood, frozen, his heart wrestling against the instincts of his busy life, while the boy's hopeful eyes held him in place, demanding an answer he was no longer sure he could brush aside. The man stood frozen with the boy's small hand still clinging to his sleeve when the first scoff cut through the silence. A middle-aged man, leaning against a nearby fence, let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head as if the request were absurd. "Fatherless kid," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Always asking for what he'll never have. He should know his place." His voice dripped with cruelty, each word aimed like a stone. Another voice followed, this one from a woman clutching a grocery bag. She spoke to no one in particular, her eyes narrowing at the child. "Look at him, begging strangers, no wonder. These kids grow up with nothing and think they can just take what they want." Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and she adjusted her grip on the bag as if the boy's presence were an inconvenience to her. The boy's shoulders sagged at the sound, but his eyes remained locked on the man in the suit, pleading silently. His fingers trembled slightly against the fabric of the sleeve, the weight of humiliation pressing on him more than the hopeful request he had whispered. His lips moved as if to speak again, but no words came. His chest rose and fell quickly, and though he tried to remain brave, the sting of the insults was etched across his face. The man in the suit heard it all. The mocking voices wrapped around him, filling the air with judgment he could not ignore. His eyes flicked toward the bystanders, their sneers, their folded arms, their disdain disguised as casual commentary. He felt torn in two. One part of him, the part that lived by schedules and logic, told him to walk away. It told him to shake off the boy's grip, to pretend he had not heard, to continue toward the safety of the life he knew. It would be easier, safer, cleaner, but another part of him lingered. It was not reason, but something deeper, something human that rooted his feet to the pavement. The cruelty he had just heard struck him harder than the boy's request had. He saw in the child's trembling hand and downcast shoulders the cost of those words. He knew walking away now would not only leave the boy empty, but confirm the very mockery ringing in the air. The boy shifted slightly, as though expecting rejection, but still held on. The man felt the pressure of choice weighing heavily on him. He could be another stranger who brushed the child off, feeding the cruel whispers, or he could do something no one expected, something that might silence the sneers that poisoned the street. His chest tightened as he looked once more into the boy's eyes, the faint glimmer of hope battling against humiliation. In that gaze, the man saw not just a child, but a chance to challenge every cruel voice echoing around them. The man felt the weight of every eye on him, the whispers swirling, the cruel remarks still hanging in the air like smoke. Logic told him to walk away, to preserve his polished world of schedules and meetings, but something deeper pushed against the surface. He looked at the boy again, small, trembling, holding on to him with the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to cling to. In that moment, the man's chest tightened, not from discomfort, but from something raw and human that he could not explain. Slowly, almost uncertainly, he bent down on one knee so he could meet the boy's gaze at eye level. The suit that once seemed like armor now felt insignificant as his knees touched the pavement. The boy's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face before it transformed into radiant hope. The man reached out a hand, steady now, and nodded gently. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Just for today, I'll be your dad." The words were simple, but they cracked the tension of the street like thunder. Gasps rippled through the bystanders, some covering their mouths, others whispering in astonishment. The cruel sneers that had mocked the boy fell into silence, drowned out by the murmur of shock. The caretaker near the playground clutched her chest, her eyes misting as she watched. Even the jogger who had slowed earlier stopped completely, shaking his head as if he could not believe what he had just seen. The boy, though, did not hesitate. His small hands shot forward, gripping the man's with a fierceness that betrayed just how long he had waited for this moment. His face lit up brighter than the sun overhead, his smile wide enough to wash away the sting of every cruel word he had ever heard. "Dad," he whispered at first, testing the word on his lips. Then louder, braver, bursting with pride. "Dad!" His voice echoed through the street, carrying both joy and defiance, as though daring the world to take it back from him. The man felt the words strike his heart with unexpected force. He had never imagined being called that by this child or any child, but hearing it now felt like a gift he did not deserve yet could not refuse. He squeezed the boy's hand, steady and protective, and rose to his feet with him. The boy clung to his side, beaming as though the world had finally given him a place where he belonged. Around them, the crowd shifted. Some smiled softly, touched by the scene, while others struggled to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their own prejudices. The murmurs grew louder, not mocking this time, but awed. The cruel words that had been thrown earlier now seemed hollow, pathetic in comparison to the sight before them. The man, once so preoccupied with his own life, realized he had stepped into something far greater than himself. In one small decision, he had silenced cruelty and given hope, and though he had only promised just for today, he knew in his heart that this moment would live far longer than a single day. The man had expected awkwardness, perhaps even regret, when he let the word "Dad" echo on the boy's lips. But as the morning turned into afternoon, something unexpected unfolded. The boy held his hand tightly as they walked back through the gates of the orphanage. His steps were lighter, his shoulders no longer slumped with the weight of loneliness. He beamed as he announced to the staff that his dad had come for him, his voice proud and loud enough for everyone to hear. The staff, startled at first, looked at the man in his press suit with questions in their eyes. Yet when they saw the boy's radiant smile and the certainty with which he clung to the man's hand, they chose not to speak the doubts aloud. Instead, they welcomed him politely, offering coffee, curious about this unexpected figure who had stepped into the role so suddenly. The man returned their nods quietly, still unsure of how he had gotten here, but unable to pull away from the boy's unshakable joy. At the lunch table, the boy pulled out a chair for him with exaggerated excitement, grinning ear to ear. The man sat among the children, his briefcase awkwardly propped against the leg of the chair. Plates of simple food were passed around, and the boy introduced him to each child at the table as though he were a king presenting an honored guest. "This is my dad," he declared proudly, his voice carrying across the room. The other children stared, wide-eyed, some whispering to one another. For many of them, the word "dad" was a foreign treasure, one they had longed for but never spoken with such confidence. The man felt their eyes on him, but when he looked back, he saw not judgment, but awe. He picked up his fork, tasted the food, and for the first time that day, smiled genuinely. The boy's laughter bubbled out, a sound so pure it made the room grow still. Some of the other children laughed with him, the energy infectious. For the first time in a long while, the boy did not look like the quiet shadow on the playground. He looked alive, radiant, certain of his place at the table. Throughout the afternoon, they played in the yard. The boy tugged him from swings to slides, showing him corners of the orphanage as though revealing hidden treasures. Each time he laughed, the man felt something inside him shift, a softening he had not known he needed. The children whispered among themselves, glancing with admiration, some asking timidly if they too could join in. By the time the sun began to set, the boy's face was flushed from excitement, his eyes bright with a happiness so rarely seen. The man looked down at the child holding his hand and realized the laughter he had heard that day might have been the boy's first in months. The whispers of awe from the other children lingered, proof that something extraordinary had happened not just for the boy, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The day that had begun with a simple request began to take on a new layer as whispers moved quietly among the staff. The man who had knelt on the sidewalk, who had sat at the lunch table among children with scuffed shoes and shy smiles, was not the ordinary passerby they had first assumed. One of the senior staff members, who often read the business pages of the paper in the evenings, had recognized him almost immediately. His name was often attached to headlines about mergers, charitable donations, and speeches given in towering glass offices far from the cracked pavement outside the orphanage gates. At first, she kept the realization to herself, not wanting to interrupt the unusual joy that filled the dining hall. But as the hours passed, and she watched him patiently help the children stack blocks, listened to him laugh, when one of the younger boys spilled juice across his sleeve, the truth seemed too heavy to keep quiet. She whispered it to another staff member whose eyes widened in disbelief, Soon the secret spread like wildfire, rippling from one corner of the room to the next, until nearly everyone present knew. By the time he stood to stretch his legs, a hush had settled over the room. The children noticed the shift in tone, though they could not understand it. The staff, however, could not stop stealing glances. They were looking not at a stranger anymore, but at a man whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond the walls of this institution. Some could not reconcile the image before them. A powerful business leader crouching low to listen to a child's story about a missing toy, his suit jacket folded neatly over a chair, his tie loosened as though he had forgotten the formality he carried in the outside world. When one of the braver staff members finally approached, her voice trembled with hesitation. She asked carefully if he was indeed the man they thought he was. He gave a small smile, almost sheepish, and nodded. "Yes," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his tone, only quiet acknowledgement. He glanced at the boy who still clung to his hand and added, "But today I am just here for him." The words stunned those who heard them. They had expected perhaps denial or perhaps pride, but not humility. It was as though he had set aside every ounce of stature the world attached to his name and traded it for the role of a father, even if borrowed for a single day. The staff exchanged looks, their eyes moist, their hearts softened by the sight. The boy beamed even brighter, though he did not fully understand the weight of the revelation. For him, the man was not a businessman or a public figure. He was simply Dad, the one who had sat with him, eaten with him, and laughed with him when he needed it most. And in that truth, the man's wealth seemed smaller than the warmth he carried in that moment, proving that titles and riches meant little compared to the gift of kindness and presence. Word of what had happened inside the orphanage spread faster than anyone expected. A single afternoon, born out of a boy's fragile question and a man's surprising decision, grew into a story that traveled beyond the playground fences. Staff whispered it first, telling friends and family about the powerful businessman who had knelt down when others sneered, who had chosen to say yes to a child no one else would. Parents picking up their children heard it from the caretakers, volunteers repeated it in their communities, and before long, it became a tale people shared in grocery lines, in coffee shops, even in offices far removed from the orphanage itself. The boy's life shifted almost instantly. Where once he had been quiet, shadowed by loneliness, he now carried himself with a light that could not be ignored. Other children noticed it too. They saw how he smiled more easily, how laughter returned to him, how his steps no longer dragged with the weight of longing. He told anyone who would listen that he had a dad, even if just for a day, and the pride in his voice silenced the cruel whispers that had once followed him. What he had been given was more than a moment of play acting. It was hope, something real enough to nurture him through days and nights that once felt too heavy. The orphanage itself felt the change. The man who had once hurried by with a briefcase now became a presence in their world, not as a fleeting guest, but as someone invested. Support arrived quietly at first: new supplies, better meals, small donations that helped ease burdens. But behind them was his influence, his decision to use his resources not for show but for genuine care. The staff who had once whispered in awe of his humility now watched as his involvement strengthened their work. Walls that had needed repair were fixed, programs that had struggled found new funding, and the children themselves noticed the difference. Their days became brighter, their world a little wider. The man was changed too. For years, he had lived in a world of numbers, deals, and relentless forward motion. He measured life in profits and deadlines, but now, when he thought back to the tug on his sleeve and the trembling voice that asked him for just one day, he realized how narrow his world had been. He replayed the laughter at the lunch table, the pride in the boy's eyes when he said the word "Dad," and something inside him softened permanently. What had begun as a decision he could not explain became a turning point he could not undo. He no longer walked past the orphanage as though it were invisible. He carried its voices with him, letting them shape how he moved through every other part of his life. The story, carried from mouth to mouth, became larger than the moment itself. It was told as proof that dignity outshines cruelty, that compassion holds more power than mockery, and that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness ripple further than grand gestures ever could. People repeated it because it reminded them that judgment can be silenced, that love can be borrowed and still transform, and that even one day of care can plant hope strong enough to last a lifetime.